All right, Ken, I have to go with you because you've been saying this thing was going to wrap up for a while. Any new signs of specifically when we're going to get it and how it's all going to go down? And I sure hope you're not planning on going on vacation this next week.
Indeed not. There are some new signs, Stephanie. We are being told by law enforcement officials and congressional officials that the report could be delivered to the Attorney General any day now, really, and likely within the next week. And yes, as you mentioned, Pete Williams and I reported back in December that Mueller was wrapping up and that a report was likely to be sent over to the Attorney General as early as mid-February. I always assumed that that could slip a little bit. We're now closing in on the end of February. And now this week we've seen many other news organizations catching up, and they are also being told that a report is imminent. As you said, it will be a confidential report sent over to Attorney General William Barr. That's what the rules say. It may be a voluminous report, but it will be secret, and then it will be up to the Attorney General to decide what he can release and how he can release it. The rules are a little vague about that. There's some mention of a brief notification to Congress, but there's also precedent in Watergate for Congress being sent a full grand jury report for a prosecutor in the event that there are impeachable offenses. So there's a lot that's up in the air here, but there's an expectation that the public will learn shortly what Robert Mueller has found.
All right, Eli, take us inside the White House. What are people there telling you? Are they worried this could hurt the president politically, legally, or not at all?
I think most of the concern is about the political implications of this and what else is in the report that hasn't already leaked out publicly through news reporting that could be damaging to the president, that could affect several news cycles and possibly weaken his standing, and maybe, worst case scenario, put significant pressure on Republicans in Congress to actually consider something as serious as impeachment ultimately. I think that's what they're trying to avoid. I don't think they're too concerned about that just yet. They feel like the president has kept Republicans in Congress there. He's done a good job, they think, at the White House of kind of muddying the waters and making sure that people who support the president don't trust the findings, whatever they are, ultimately. And so it's always been that sort of political response to this legal investigation, and that is sort of what the president will continue to do. I think some people, if you talk to them privately, they're a little concerned about how the president will react because he consumes the news and he reacts in real time. Not a lot of impulse control there. And so certainly we don't, there's a lot of questions about what will come out of the report, how much will Barr release to the public. Certainly, if there's exculpatory stuff about the president in there, he's liable to just tweet it out himself. But there are some concerns there about if it's damaging, how the president will respond to that publicly.
Well, the public is already so confused because Rudy Giuliani has very successfully muddied the waters as things come out. You can't even remember what you had heard before. Walk me through what would be acceptable to the general public. Like, put outrage aside. We know that Bill Barr has he's already sort of paved the way, saying, I don't know if I'm going to be sharing everything. Maybe things that are only a legal issue, not a political issue. Or if we do get something, it might be a cut-down version of what Congress gets. And what Congress gets might be a cut-down version of what the White House gets.
So from the perspective of the president's allies, what we've seen has been the information that has come out so far has been legally exculpatory, very politically damaging, but they focus on the fact that it doesn't indict the president personally or even the members of his campaign team for being engaged in some sort of a conspiracy with Russia.
But aren't there levels of his allies? Right, you've got the hardcore Kellyanne Conways that are human shields. But then you've got the Mitch McConnells, the Paul Ryans. Are they in a different position with how they view this report?
Somewhat, but if they were to rely on the filtering of the information through conservative media and his conservative allies who rely on the exculpatory evidence here and less on the fact that the president was surrounded by individuals who were in sordid relationships with people like WikiLeaks, for example, which has a connection to Russian intelligence, just by virtue of saying, well, the president seems to be absolved here from any sort of conspiracy with Russian officials, Russian intelligence, that is enough to indemnify the president and to get these Republicans to lean on that information and sort of divorce themselves from the really politically damaging effects of the president's relationships with these sordid individuals.
Jim, if Mueller does not find evidence of conspiracy and Democrats keep pushing the issue, do they risk getting backlash from Americans who say, this has been 2 years, enough is enough, we said let Bob Mueller do it, he did it, let's move on?
Possibly, but I think if you look at the standards of Nixon, Bill Clinton impeachment in the past, likely what you'll see out of the Mueller investigation would be something that in the past Congress would very seriously consider impeachment. Those standards have changed because, look, this is what Donald Trump has done for the last 2 years. He's discredited, he's tried to discredit the Mueller investigation, and it was all meant for this moment. It was all leading up to this moment so that when a report came out that is going to be very, very damaging, whether it's legally very, very damaging, we don't know, but it would be damaging, but it is designed for him to survive this moment.
But can we honestly talk about what's been done in the past and precedent? I've banned the word unprecedented on this show because that's the last 2 years. So can we honestly say, well, this has got to happen because this has happened before? I mean, we threw that out the window already.
Yeah, we've thrown it out the window. But at the same time, we're going to have a report that's coming out. There's going to be enormous pressure that this report be released. It will be extremely politically damaging, perhaps very legally damaging. And look, the filters that we have now, the media filters, are very, very different. Trump's done an excellent job with his henchmen to discredit Mueller. But the report is, it's going to be written in black and white. People can read it.
Maya, let's go to the sleeper, Southern District of New York. Next week, Michael Cohen is expected to testify publicly in the House. We know he is a big part of the ongoing investigations that are happening right here in New York City. How big of a deal is that?
Well, his testimony is going to be less of a deal than the fact that there's an ongoing investigation. Because in his testimony, what we know from Elijah Cummings is he is not going to talk about the fundamental question of Trump Tower Moscow. That's the conversation that is more of a link to the conversation about conspiracy and collusion. But the point here is on the Southern District, this isn't over. And I think there's been this is more maybe semantic, but, for reporters who say we're hearing this is wrapping up, for lawyers, we're like, this is nowhere near over. There is no wrap up. So what Mueller has done, if you think about this as a 3-act play, we've seen the first 2 acts. The first year, right, in 2017, was the investigation setting the stage and starting to get those initial plea deals and indictments that really gave him the evidentiary platform for what then became 2018, which was the much deeper level of investigation, which now has resulted in the indictment of Roger Stone, right, in January. That has now taken us to his report, meaning we have the Department of Justice with a memorandum saying we will not indict a sitting president. There was never a question for the Justice Department about whether there was going to be an indictment of Donald Trump. The issue here was, and we've heard this from Andrew McCabe yesterday on MSNBC, that there has been a concerted effort to protect the ongoing investigations by spinning it out to U.S. attorneys' offices. So Act 3 is the U.S. attorney's offices. This is not wrapping with a report. This is wrapping with the continued investigations, the potential indictments that may come from the Southern District of New York, from Virginia, from D.C.
Ken, I got to ask you about Roger Stone. He's going to be in court today to face the judge whose picture he put on Instagram just moments ago. We saw him arrive in D.C. What do you think is going to happen? Because, yes, even if he took the post down, he put it up there. He knew the damage it would do. He knew the message he was sending to his loyal supporters.
Yeah, at a minimum, Stephanie, he's going to get a dressing down by Judge Amy Berman Jackson. It's possible that she could throw him in jail. She certainly did with Paul Manafort. But Manafort had been accused of the crime of witness tampering. Stone has not formally been accused of a crime. It could, it's conceivable that the crime of a threat to a federal judge could be in play here. But he does have a First Amendment right to criticize the investigation, however unwise that is. I think at a minimum, though, you're going to see he's going to have a rough time in court with this federal judge today.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.